The world, for Earl Thompson, was divided into three things: the land you could hunt, the dogs you hunted with, and the family you fed. For 40 years, that trinity had been his church. The dense pine-choked hills of the Ouachita National Forest, his cathedral. He was a hog hunter, but that title was an insult in its simplicity. He was a scholar of the deep woods, a master of tracking, a conductor of a canine orchestra that could bring the most vicious tusked boar to bay. His hands, thick with calluses and scarred by briars and blades, knew the heft of a rifle and the reassuring warmth of a hound's ear with equal intimacy. His reputation was etched into the county lines, spoken with respect in feed stores and diners from Mena to Hot Springs. Earl Thompson and his dogs didn't just hunt hogs. They were a force of nature, an answer to the plague of feral swine that tore up farmland and terrorized livestock. His lead dog, the patriarch of his pack, had been Old Blue, a Catahoula mix with one clouded eye and a heart full of grit that belied his aging frame. Blue was more than a dog. He was a partner, a living extension of Earl's own will and instinct. He was the anchor of the pack, the silent general whose low growl could steady the younger, more reckless hounds. He was family. And now he was dead. The change came not as a slow dawn, but as a lightning strike that shattered Earl's world. It had been a simple job, a favor for a rancher named Calloway whose property abutted the national forest. Hogs were getting into his pastures, rooting up fences. Earl had set up a temporary kennel for his best 5 dogs, including Blue, near a creek bed on the edge of Calloway's land, planning to start the hunt proper the next morning. It was familiar territory, a place he'd hunted 100 times. He'd left them fed and watered, secure in the heavy-gauge chain-link run, and driven the 10 miles back to his own small house with the easy confidence of a man in his element. The call from a frantic Calloway came just after sunrise. Earl's stomach had clenched into a cold, hard knot. He'd heard the tremor in the old rancher's voice and known it was bad. But he wasn't prepared for the reality. The kennel looked like a bomb had gone off inside it. The chain link, thick enough to hold a bear, was torn from its steel poles, twisted into metallic ribbons. The gate was bent in half, its heavy latch sheared clean off. Splintered wood from the doghouses littered the muddy ground, and the scent of blood was so thick it was a taste in the back of his throat. Of the 5 dogs, they found only pieces. It was a methodical, brutal slaughter. Not the work of a predator killing for food, but something that had killed with a furious, explosive rage. Earl had knelt, his bad knee screaming in protest, and gathered what was left of Old Blue, a scrap of brindlehide and the collar he'd put on him when he was just a pup. The grief was a physical thing, a crushing weight on his chest that stole his breath. But beneath the grief, a darker, hotter emotion began to smolder, a pure, clarifying rage. He was a man who understood the violence of nature. He'd seen what bears could do, what a cornered boar was capable of. This was different. And then he saw the tracks. They were everywhere in the churned mud around the kennel, deep and clear. They were not the round, clawed prints of a black bear. They were not the cloven hooves of a hog. They were long, vaguely canine, but with a horrifying addition: a distinct heel print. They were the tracks of something impossibly heavy that had walked at times on 2 legs. Something had stood here on hind legs and ripped the kennel apart with its forelimbs. The new situation was this: the familiar woods were no longer his. Something else had claimed them, and it had sealed its claim with the blood of his dogs. His profession, his identity, was now bent toward a single, terrible purpose. This was no longer a hunt. It was an extermination. He was alert, but it was the alertness of a soldier stepping onto a battlefield, not a hunter entering the woods. He was moving into a territory that was both intimately familiar and terrifyingly new, a place where the rules he had lived by for 40 years had been violently rewritten. He would go back in, not with his best dogs because they were gone, but with the rest of his pack, his brother, and a score to settle that was deeper than bone. Before they loaded the trucks, Earl's brother Bobby had insisted they stop for coffee at the dusty Crossroads diner that served as the local hub of information and gossip. Earl hated the delay, the rage in his gut a living coal that demanded the bellows of action. But Bobby was the cautious one, the planner. He wanted to know if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of frying bacon and stale coffee. A few old-timers in seed caps occupied their usual booths, their conversation dropping to a murmur as the Thompson brothers walked in. The news had already traveled. Jed, the owner, a man with a face like a worn leather boot, just shook his head slowly as he filled their mugs. "Heard about your dogs, Earl," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Damn shame. Calloway's been having problems for months." Earl looked up from his coffee, his eyes narrowed. "What kind of problems?" "Fences torn down. A calf gone missing last month just vanished. Found a bit of hide is all. He thought it was poachers. Maybe not." Jed leaned closer, lowering his voice further. "That stretch of woods back in the hollows, it's got a reputation, always has." From a corner booth, a gnarled old man named Silas, who'd logged these hills for 50 years before his back gave out, piped up. "My granddaddy used to call it the Dogwood Devil's Ground. Said things walked in there that shouldn't." Earl snorted, a harsh, dismissive sound. "Superstitious nonsense, Silas. It's a bear. A big one, maybe rabid." Silas just took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze unwavering. "A bear don't walk on its hind legs for a quarter mile, Earl. And it don't peel chain link like the top of a sardine can. A fella from the Forestry Service, a young kid, was marking timber back in there 2 weeks ago. Quit the next day, packed his bags, and moved back to Little Rock. Didn't even pick up his last check. Just said he saw something watching him from the trees. Something big and smart." Bobby shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had more room for superstition than Earl did. "What did it look like?" "He wouldn't say," Silas said, turning his gaze to his cup. "Just that it wasn't right. You boys be careful. Some things are best left alone." Earl threw a few dollars on the counter and stood up, his jaw set like granite. "We're not leaving it alone." His reaction was pure dismissal, a wall of anger and grief that couldn't allow for doubt or folklore. To entertain such stories was to give the thing that killed his dogs a mythic quality, to elevate it beyond something he could put in his sights and destroy. It had to be flesh and blood. It had to be an animal. A freak, maybe, but an animal nonetheless. They drove back to Earl's property to load up the rest of the gear and the other dogs. As they passed the turnoff to Calloway's ranch, Earl's eyes were drawn to the physical signs that had started this nightmare. He could still see it all with perfect clarity. The damaged fencing of the kennel, not just pushed over but ripped apart with a strength that defied belief. The missing livestock, or in his case, his missing family, his dogs. He'd seen a few strange marks on the trees near the site. Deep gouges in the bark of a massive oak, a good 7 feet off the ground. He'd told himself it was a bear marking its territory, but it didn't feel right. The claw marks were too deep, too widely spaced. And the ground, the disturbed earth and the horrific remains. He had forced himself to examine the tracks again and again, trying to make them fit a known animal. They were too long for a bear, the toes too splayed, and that clear, human-like heel print was the detail his mind kept trying to reject. He tried to rationalize it all. Maybe it was a massive bear with a foot deformity. Maybe a cougar and a bear had both been there, creating a confusing mess of signs. Maybe local kids, vandals with wire cutters and a cruel streak, had done it and let a predator in. But his gut, the instinct honed by a lifetime in the woods, rejected every excuse. The evidence pointed to one impossible conclusion, and his internal rationalization was just a desperate attempt to keep the world sane. The warnings from the diner, the physical evidence at the site, it was all painting a picture he refused to look at directly. He blamed a freak of nature, an aberration he could hunt and kill. He could not consider Silas's quiet mention of a devil in the dogwoods. Not yet. They made their base camp 2 miles deeper into the national forest than where the kennel had been attacked, following the direction the strange tracks had taken. It was a small, defensible clearing on a slight rise, surrounded by a thick stand of short-leaf pine and tangled muscadine vines. Earl's nephew, Dale, a young man of 20 who was more accustomed to video games than the deep woods but eager to prove himself, helped Bobby string up a heavy-duty tarp between 2 pickups. The third man was Frank, a quiet, wiry Vietnam vet who hunted with the cold efficiency of a sniper. He said little, his eyes constantly scanning the trees. The atmosphere was not one of a typical hunting camp. There was no easy banter, no passing of a flask, no laughter. The air was heavy with a grim sense of purpose. They were an occupying army in hostile territory. The 4 new dogs, younger, faster hounds, but without Old Blue's steadying presence, whined nervously in the transport cages on the back of Earl's truck, their breath misting in the cooling twilight air. They could smell the lingering scent of blood and predator in this part of the forest, and they didn't like it. Earl felt a pang of guilt for bringing them, but they were his tools, his weapons. He needed their noses. He needed their. As darkness fell, it brought a profound, watchful silence. The usual chorus of crickets and frogs was muted, subdued. Earl built a large, crackling fire in the center of their camp, the flames pushing back the oppressive shadows. They sat around it, cleaning their rifles for the 3rd time, the metallic scrape and click of bolts the only sound besides the fire. Earl held his .30-06, its stock worn smooth by his own hands. Frank had his semi-automatic AR-10, a military-grade weapon that seemed an obscene overmatch for a hog, but now felt chillingly appropriate. Bobby and Dale had heavy-caliber lever-action rifles. They settled in for the night, taking watches in pairs. The unease was a palpable thing, a 5th member of their party. Every gust of wind in the pines sounded like a footstep. Every shadow thrown by the firelight seemed to move with intent. There was no clear threat, just the suffocating feeling of being observed by unseen eyes. Earl took the first watch with Dale. The young man was jumpy, his head snapping around at every sound. "Just the woods settling, son," Earl said, his voice low, trying to project a calm he didn't feel. "Doesn't feel right, Uncle Earl," Dale whispered, clutching his rifle. "It's too quiet." He was right. Around midnight, the first distinct sound came, a heavy snap from the darkness beyond the firelight. Not a twig, but a branch, thick as a man's arm. It was too heavy for a deer, too deliberate for a falling limb. The dogs in the cages, who had been fitfully sleeping, went instantly silent. Their silence was more terrifying than any barking could have been. An hour later, the circling began. They couldn't see anything, but they could hear it. A slow, heavy tread moving through the leaf litter, making a wide perimeter around their camp. It would stop for long minutes, and the silence would stretch their nerves taut before the soft crunch of a footfall would begin again from a different direction. It was intelligent. It was studying them. Frank and Bobby took the next watch. It was Frank who heard it first, a faint metallic scratching sound from near his truck. He clicked on his powerful handheld spotlight, its beam cutting a sharp white tunnel into the night. The sound stopped. The beam swept across the side of the truck, revealing nothing. But the thing was close. It was testing their barriers. The final, terrifying proof came just before dawn during Earl's second watch. From the dense thicket to the south, A sound rose that froze the blood in his veins. It started as a low, guttural growl full of menace, but it twisted into something else, a high-pitched chuffing sound that was horribly intelligent, like a distorted imitation of a human cough. It was a vocalization of pure contempt and warning. It was close, so close Earl could feel the vibration of it in his chest. In the cages, the dogs were flattened against the far walls, trembling violently, not making a single sound. When the first gray light of morning finally broke through the canopy, it felt less like a sunrise and more like a temporary reprieve. The oppressive presence in the dark had retreated with the shadows, but the evidence of its visit was stark and chilling. Earl was the first to see the tracks. They formed a near-perfect circle around the camp, just at the edge of where the firelight would have reached. They were the same prints from the kennel attack, long canine-like with that unmistakable heel. The creature had paced around them all night, watching, waiting. It hadn't been afraid of the fire. It had been curious. Frank found the scratch marks. He ran his fingers over 3 deep gouges in the passenger side door of his truck where he'd heard the sound during his watch. The steel was peeled back in thin curls, revealing the primer underneath. The marks were a foot apart, made by something with immense power and sharp, thick claws. "Look at the height," Frank said, his voice flat. The scratches were level with his shoulder. Bobby discovered that a heavy-duty cooler they had left near the edge of camp had been moved. It was full of ice, drinks, and food, weighing well over 100 pounds. It had been dragged 20 feet into the brush, as if something had picked it up to inspect it and then tossed it aside. The lid was dented but not broken through. Whatever it was strong enough to treat the cooler like a toy. The cumulative effect of the night's activity and the morning's discoveries settled over the men like a shroud. The bravado from the day before had evaporated, replaced by a cold, grim reality. This was not a dumb animal they were hunting. It was smart, powerful, and bold. It had deliberately let them know it was there. It was a clear message. "You are in my house now." Earl looked at the faces of his crew. Dale was pale, his youthful eagerness replaced by a wide-eyed fear. Bobby was frowning, constantly rechecking the action on his rifle, his pragmatism warring with a growing dread. Only Frank seemed unchanged, his expression a mask of hardened resolve, but even his eyes held a new, watchful intensity. "It's playing with us," Bobby said, finally giving voice to what they were all thinking. "It knows we're here for it." "Good," Earl growled, his own fear buried deep under a fresh layer of rage. "Let it know. We're not leaving until this is finished." He looked at the dog cages. The hounds were still subdued, huddled and quiet. He opened the doors and they crept out cautiously, staying close to his legs, their noses twitching, sampling the terrifying scent of the night visitor. He clipped the leads onto the 2 best tracking dogs. Their reluctance was obvious, but their loyalty to Earl was stronger. He gave the lead to the older of the 2, a plot hound named Rusty. After a moment of hesitation, Rusty lowered his nose to the clearest track and let out a low, mournful bay. The hunt was on. The trail led them deeper into the Ouachitas, into a part of the forest that felt older, more primal. The pines gave way to dense hardwoods and cypress, the ground growing softer and damper underfoot. Sunlight struggled to pierce the thick canopy, casting the forest in a perpetual twilight. The air grew heavy and humid, smelling of mud and decay. They were descending into a swampy bottomland, a place where the world felt ancient and untouched. The creature's tracks were easy to follow. It wasn't trying to hide its passage. It moved with a long, confident stride, crashing through undergrowth that a man would have to pick his way through carefully. For the first hour, the dogs tracked eagerly, their confidence returning as they focused on the scent. But as they went deeper, their behavior began to change. They grew hesitant, whining low in their throats, needing constant encouragement from Earl. The signs of the creature's continued presence were everywhere, and they grew more unsettling with each mile. It was as if it was deliberately leaving them a trail of breadcrumbs, each one a display of its power and ferocity. They found a deer carcass, a large doe sprawled in a clearing. It hadn't been eaten. It had been torn in half, the two pieces lying yards apart. The sheer, impossible strength required for such an act sent a fresh wave of cold dread through the men. No bear could do that. Further on, they found a tree, a thick hickory that had been savaged. The bark was shredded from the ground up to a height of 8 feet, and the wood beneath was splintered, gouged by massive claws. It looked less like a territorial marking and more like an explosion of pure, unadulterated rage. Dale stopped and stared at it, his face ashen. "What the hell could do that?" he whispered. No one answered. The pattern was undeniable. The creature wasn't fleeing. It was leading them on, drawing them into its domain. It was becoming bolder, its actions more overt. This wasn't just an animal moving through its territory. This was a deliberate, intelligent being setting the stage for a confrontation on its own terms. The moment of truth, the one that stripped away the last vestiges of their denial, came mid-afternoon. They were moving through a particularly dense section of canebrake, the tall stalks rustling around them, visibility reduced to a few yards. The dogs were practically crawling, their bellies low to the ground. Suddenly up ahead, there was a flicker of movement. It was about 80 yards away, across a small, stagnant creek. For a split second, a figure stepped into a rare patch of sunlight. It was tall, covered in coarse black fur, and it was moving with a fluid, powerful grace. It paused for a heartbeat, turning its head in their direction, and Earl saw a pointed canine muzzle. Then it did something that shattered his reality. It rose up from a crouch onto 2 long, muscular legs and took 3 loping strides, disappearing behind a massive cypress tree with a speed that was unnatural. The world seemed to stop. The air left Earl's lungs. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a man in a suit. It was something else, something that belonged in the dark corners of folklore, not in the broad, if muted, daylight of an Arkansas swamp. "Did you see that?" Bobby breathed, his voice choked with disbelief. Frank had his rifle half raised. "I saw it." Dale just stood frozen, his knuckles white on the stock of his gun. The daylight sighting changed everything. It was one thing to follow monstrous tracks and see evidence of its strength. It was another thing entirely to see it with their own eyes. A living, breathing impossibility. The realization crashed down on Earl with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a freak animal. This was a monster, and it was intelligent. It had let them see it. It knew they were there, it knew they were following, and it had revealed itself for a moment as a deliberate act of intimidation. This was no longer a hunt to avenge his dogs. This was a territorial dispute, and they were the intruders. The creature was not their prey. It was the landlord, and it was about to serve them an eviction notice written in blood. The fear that he had been suppressing for 2 days finally broke through the wall of his rage, cold and sharp, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his soul, that they had made a terrible, terrible mistake. The walk back to the trucks was silent and tense. The daylight sighting had fundamentally altered the dynamic. The men moved with their heads on a swivel, rifles held at a low ready, flinching at every snapped twig. The woods no longer felt neutral. They felt hostile, alive and watchful. The creature was out there, somewhere in the oppressive green twilight, and it had seen them, measured them. When they reached the relative safety of their camp, the unspoken question hung heavy in the humid air. They gathered around the cold fire pit, the setting sun casting long, ominous shadows through the trees. Dale was the first to break the silence. "Uncle Earl, we should go," he said. his voice barely a whisper. "We should pack up and get the hell out of here. Call the sheriff, the Forest Service, somebody." "And tell them what?" Bobby countered, his voice strained. "That we saw a 7-foot-tall dogman in the swamp? They'll laugh us out of the county. They'll think we're drunk or crazy." "I'd rather be called crazy than be what happened to that deer," Dale shot back, his fear making him bold. Earl stared into the fire pit, turning the options over in his mind. The factors swirled in a chaotic mix. His professional obligation, his pride as a hunter who had never backed down from anything in these woods, was at war with the primal fear the sighting had ignited. He thought of Old Blue, of the shredded kennel, and the rage flared again, hot and stubborn. To leave now felt like a betrayal. It felt like letting the monster win. It was a matter of pride, a refusal to be run out of his own territory by some nameless beast. His entire identity was tied to his mastery of this wilderness, and to flee from one of its inhabitants was unthinkable. "We're not leaving," Earl said, his voice low and final. It was a command, not a suggestion. "We came here to finish this. We're finishing it." "Earl, be reasonable," Bobby pleaded. "This isn't a hog or a bear. We don't know what it is. We saw it for 2 seconds. We don't know what it's capable of." "We know it killed my dogs," Earl said, his gaze hard as flint. "That's all I need to know. It bleeds. If it bleeds, we can kill it." Frank, who had been methodically stripping and cleaning his rifle, finally spoke. "He's right," he said, not looking up from his work. "Running won't solve anything. It knows our scent. It knows our camp. If we try to pack up and leave in the dark, we're vulnerable. Our best chance is to fortify our position and meet it on our own terms right here." Frank's cold logic seemed to cut through the fear. It was a soldier's assessment of a tactical situation, and it resonated with Earl's own stubbornness. The decision was made. They would stay. With the choice made, a new energy surged through the camp. Fear was channeled into action. Their preparation was no longer for a hunt, but for a siege. They would make their stand. First, they secured the location. They backed the 2 pickup trucks together, tailgate to tailgate, creating a solid wall of steel on one side of the camp. They used the remaining chain link from Calloway's damaged kennel, which Earl had thrown in the truck bed out of sheer anger, and stretched it between the trucks and 2 thick pine trees, creating a crude but effective fence around their small perimeter. It wouldn't stop the creature, but it would slow it down, force it into a channel. Next came the weapons. They pooled their ammunition on a tarp, sorting the heavy caliber rounds. Frank produced 2 military-grade Claymore mines from a locked footlocker in his truck. "Perimeter defense," he said simply, ignoring Bobby and Dale's shocked stares. He set them up facing the 2 most likely avenues of approach, running the tripwires to his position by the fire. They broke out the heavy-duty spotlights. They had 2 large million-candle-power lights, which they wired directly to the truck batteries, mounting them on the roofs of the cabs to create overlapping fields of fire, illuminating the clearing and the dark tree line beyond. They turned the camp into a small, harsh island of light in a vast sea of darkness. Finally, Earl took out his cell phone. The signal was weak, a single flickering bar. He called his wife. He kept his voice steady, telling her they were camped out for one more night, that the hunting was tough. He told her he loved her. It was a conversation heavy with unspoken possibilities, a final check-in before stepping into the unknown. He was informing her, in his own way, of the situation, ensuring that if they didn't come back, she knew where they had been. He didn't tell her the truth, but the gravity in his voice was a message in itself. As full darkness fell, the 4 men took their positions inside their makeshift fortress. The fire was built up high, a roaring beacon of defiance. The spotlights hummed, bathing the trees in an unnatural, sterile white light. The air was electric with anticipation. They were no longer hunters. They were bait in a trap of their own design, waiting for the monster to come and claim it. The first few hours of the night were deceptively calm. The forest was silent again, a dead, waiting quiet that was more unnerving than the sounds of the previous night. The men sat, backs against the trucks, rifles across their laps, their eyes scanning the brilliantly lit tree line. The world was reduced to the circle of their light and the immense, pressing darkness beyond it. The challenge, when it came, was not a wild, screaming charge out of the darkness. It was far more terrifying. It began with the dogs. They had been silent in their cages, but now they began to whimper, a low, pathetic sound of pure terror. Then from the swampy hollow to the west came a single, heavy footstep. Then another. Something was walking, not running, directly towards their camp. It moved with a slow, deliberate cadence, the heavy footfalls crushing leaves and snapping twigs with an unnerving rhythm. It was not trying to be stealthy. It was announcing its approach. This was a clear, unambiguous challenge, a definitive, aggressive move to test their resolve. Frank clicked off one of the main spotlights, plunging half the camp into shadow and making the remaining beam seem even more intense. "Don't want to blind ourselves," he whispered. "Let it come into the light." The footsteps stopped just at the edge of the darkness, maybe 40 yards from their perimeter. The silence that followed was absolute. The men held their breath, their hearts hammering against their ribs. They could feel it there, just beyond the light, watching them. The sheer psychological pressure was immense. It was a test of nerves, a battle of wills played out in the suffocating darkness of the Ouachita night. Earl felt his anger returning, burning away the edges of his fear. He would not be intimidated. He stood up slowly, his .30-06 feeling like a solid, reassuring part of his own arm. "Show yourself, you son of a bitch," he snarled into the night. As if in answer, a low growl rumbled from the shadows, a sound so deep it seemed to vibrate the very ground beneath their feet. Then a massive shape detached itself from the darkness and stepped calmly into the harsh white beam of the spotlight. The reality was worse than the fleeting glimpse or the folklore. It stood a full 7 feet tall, its body a terrifying fusion of man and wolf. Its powerful legs were bent like a canine's, ending in huge, clawed feet. Its torso was broad and heavily muscled, covered in coarse, matted black fur. Its long arms, tipped with dirty, yellowed claws like railroad spikes, hung at its sides. But the head was the epicenter of the nightmare. It was the long, tapered muzzle of a timber wolf, its black lips curled back to reveal a fearsome array of yellow fangs. And set within that bestial face were its eyes. They were not the simple, reactive eyes of an animal. They were recessed, burning with a disturbing, malevolent intelligence. They were the eyes of a thinking, reasoning creature filled with an ancient hatred. It looked at them, not as a predator studying prey, but as a landowner inspecting trespassers he was about to violently remove. For a timeless second, everyone was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer, blasphemous wrongness of the thing. Then it took another step forward, lowering its head and letting out a deafening roar, a sound of pure dominance and fury that was half wolf howl, half human scream. That sound broke the spell. The moment of shock evaporated, replaced by a surge of pure, survival-driven adrenaline. Earl was the first to react. He brought the stock of his rifle to his shoulder, found the creature's massive chest in his sights, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the .30-06 was deafening in the enclosed space. The heavy slug hit the creature square in the chest with a wet, meaty thump. It staggered back a step, roaring in pain and surprise, but it didn't fall. Dark blood welled from the wound, but its intelligent eyes fixed on Earl with a new, focused fury. Frank opened up with the AR-10, the weapon barking a rapid 3-round burst. 2 more rounds struck the creature's torso and shoulder. It bellowed again, a sound of agony and rage, and charged. The speed was terrifying. It covered the 40 yards in a matter of seconds, a black whirlwind of muscle and claws. Dale fired his rifle wildly, the shot going high, and Bobby managed to get a round into its leg, causing it to stumble but not to stop. It hit the makeshift chain-link fence not as an obstacle but as a minor inconvenience. The metal shrieked and tore as the creature ripped through it with its bare hands, its eyes locked on Earl, the man who had heard it first. Earl chambered another round, but it was already too close. He saw the massive clawed hand swinging for his head, and he threw himself backwards, stumbling over a log. The claws raked through the air where his face had been, the sound like a scythe cutting through canvas. Frank, seeing Earl go down, made a split-second decision. He didn't fire his rifle, he dove for the detonator for the claymores. "Get down!" he screamed. The creature was on Earl in an instant, its hot, fetid breath washing over him. Its wolf-like muzzle snarled inches from his face, saliva dripping from its fangs. He could smell the blood, the wet fur, the primal musk of it. He brought his rifle up between them, a useless stick against its immense strength. The creature's eyes burned into his, and in them he saw not just rage, but a cold, calculating hatred. Then Frank hit the switch. One of the claymores positioned on the creature's flank erupted with a deafening whoomp. A wall of steel ball bearings shredded the air, tearing through the trees and, more importantly, into the creature's side and back. It shrieked, a high-pitched, unearthly sound of pure agony, and was thrown sideways off of Earl. It thrashed on the ground, its powerful limbs convulsing, its back and side a mangled ruin of fur and flesh. It was wounded, terribly so, but it was not dead. With a final hate-filled roar, it pushed itself up onto its feet. It gave them one last look of pure malevolence, then turned and crashed back into the darkness of the swamp, its labored, pained movements leaving a clear trail of destruction. The hunters had stood their ground. They had fought back. The creature was grievously injured, and for now it had been driven off. The immediate confrontation was over, but the silence it left behind was filled with the terrible knowledge of what they had just survived. The swamp was silent. The ringing in their ears from the gunshots and the claymore's blast slowly faded, replaced by the frantic chirping of insects that had been shocked into silence. The air was thick and acrid, a nauseating cocktail of gunpowder, ozone, and the coppery, musky scent of the creature's blood. The beam from the remaining spotlight cut a stark, lonely path across the clearing, illuminating the shredded fence, the churned-up mud, and the dark, glistening pools of blood that marked where the beast had fallen. For a long moment, no one moved. They were locked in a state of collective shock, their minds struggling to process the violent, reality-bending events of the last few minutes. Earl pushed himself up from the ground, his hands shaking, his body aching from the fall. He looked at the spot where the creature had stood over him, at the deep gouges its claws had left in the log he'd stumbled over. He could still feel its hot, foul breath on his face, see the intelligent hatred in its eyes. Bobby helped Dale to his feet. The young man was trembling uncontrollably, his rifle lying forgotten in the dirt. Frank was already moving, his face a grim mask, his combat instincts fully engaged. He cautiously approached the edge of the light, his rifle up, scanning the impenetrable wall of darkness where the creature had disappeared. Is it dead?" Dale stammered, his voice cracking. "No," Frank said without turning around. "Wounded. Badly, but not dead." The evidence was undeniable. The blood trail leading into the swamp was heavy, great splatters and pools of it soaking the leaf litter. Near the fence, they found a patch of coarse black hair, snagged on the torn metal, and the tracks in the mud where it had charged and fallen were huge, deep, and terrifyingly clear. They were the prints of a monster, proof that their ordeal was real. The aftermath of the conflict was a scene of brutal physical evidence that could not be explained away. They had faced the impossible, and they had the scars, on the land and on their minds, to prove it. Earl looked at the blood trail, then back at his men. He saw the fear in Dale's eyes, the sheer nerve-shattered exhaustion on Bobby's face. Even Frank, for all his composure, had a new, haunted look about him. There was no talk of pursuit. The thought was insane. They had survived. That was the only victory that mattered. The hunt for revenge was over, replaced by a desperate, primal need to escape. "Pack it up," Earl said, his voice a hoarse rasp. "Everything. Now. We're leaving." The decision was absolute. There was no argument, no hesitation. They moved with a frantic, desperate energy, throwing gear into the trucks with no regard for order. Tents were torn down. Coolers and bags were tossed into the beds. The remaining fence was cut away. Every sound from the surrounding darkness made them flinch, their heads snapping up, expecting the creature to return and finish the job. The work they came to do was abandoned, its purpose rendered meaningless in the face of what they had discovered. They hitched the dog cages to Earl's truck, the hounds inside still whimpering, their terror a constant, unnerving reminder of the lingering presence in the woods. Within 30 minutes, they were ready. They didn't bother to douse the fire, they left it burning, a lonely, defiant beacon in the heart of a darkness they were desperate to flee. The drive out was a nightmare. Earl drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his eyes darting between the narrow dirt track illuminated by his headlights and the rearview mirror. Every shadow seemed to hold a hulking shape. Every rustle of leaves was the sound of pursuit. They did not speak. The shared trauma was a suffocating presence in the cab of the truck, a silent scream that filled the space between them. They had gone into those woods as confident, seasoned hunters, masters of their domain. They were leaving as refugees, fleeing a power they couldn't comprehend. They did not stop until the first paved road, and even then they didn't slow down until the glow of town lights appeared on the horizon. They would not be returning to that specific hollow, to that dark and ancient swamp. It belonged to the creature now. It had always belonged to it. In the weeks that followed, a permanent change settled over Earl. The physical world was the same, but his perception of it was fundamentally altered. He sold most of his hunting dogs, keeping only 2 for companionship. He turned down requests to guide hog hunts. The thought of willingly entering the deep woods at night now filled him with a cold, visceral dread. The 4 of them never spoke of the full details of that night to anyone else. They concocted a plausible story about a massive, unusually aggressive black bear that had destroyed the kennel and charged their camp. They said they'd wounded it and it had run off. It was a flimsy lie, but it was a lie people could accept, a lie that kept their world sane. Among themselves, however, the knowledge was a silent, unbreakable bond. They carried the shared understanding of what truly lived in the remote places of the world. They knew that the maps were incomplete, that the encyclopedias of known animals were missing a chapter. Earl's approach to his life, his work, his entire relationship with the wilderness was forever altered. He had gone into the Wachitas seeking vengeance for his dogs, armed with pride and firepower. He had come out with a terrifying education. He had learned that he was not the apex predator, that humanity's dominion was a fragile illusion that ended where the deep woods began. He had intruded on a territory that was not his, challenged a sovereign he did not understand, and had been lucky to escape with his life. The knowledge he now carried was a heavy burden. Every time he looked towards the dark line of trees on the horizon, he felt a flicker of the same fear he'd felt under the creature's gaze. He knew it was still out there, wounded but alive, a guardian of a world far older and wilder than his own. And he knew, with the chilling certainty of a man who has survived his own obituary, that some things are best left alone.